My presentation is going to focus on some of the things that I'm seeing happening within the enterprise as organizations struggle to move out from their core enterprise identity management functions into the cloud for various reasons. And I think there are two specific issues that are coming to me when I talk to the organizations that I speak to. Two specific ones. The first one is, how do I do this cloud identity management business? And yes, there are multiple dimensions to the cloud identity management scheme. But I'm going to highlight two specific problems and challenges. One is that we have a constituencies to applications problem, meaning that we have an expansion of user constituencies, some that we're unfamiliar with, read partners, contractors, consumers, who are demanding access to enterprise-style resources, resources that require a high level of assurance, something I touched upon this morning. The second thing about the cloud identity management challenge is the fact that the tool set today doesn't have the ability to provide services that will drive enterprises towards using cloud identity management systems, and I'll spend some more time on that. The second thing, the challenge that I see, and I talk to many organizations who are frankly still struggling with this just to do it on the enterprise level, right, is this cloud identity and access governance. And I'm not talking about provisioning and all that. I'm talking about the cloud identity, the governance part of this that focuses on answering the question, who has access to what? This problem was barely solvable in the enterprise. Who here is using an identity and access governance system for entitlement management, self-service, role management, access certification? Okay, not enough of you. That's the short answer, right? Not enough of you. Because to do this thing at scale, you're going to have to start looking at these solutions. We have an expansion of users, those user constituencies I referred to before. And what? Meaning that we now have resources that are distributed across our partners and across the cloud too, and SaaS applications and infrastructure as a service and so on. And furthermore, the tool set required for enterprises to be able to do scalable cloud identity and access governance, let's just say, is wanting. And it's not necessarily wanting because the identity and access management vendors, the IGA vendors, are failing at their job. It's more about the maturity of the cloud and the ability to get information out of it. So let's start talking about cloud identity management and some of the challenges first. Why are people doing this? And this is a level set. I'll go through this pretty quickly. Because they have apps in the cloud that require identity and access management, right? They may have corporate apps like email, office apps, customer relationship management. And they really, in this case, they may not have any identity and access management solutions in the cloud. They simply need to provide services for users that are using cloud-based applications today. But there's also a desire for organizations to get out of this game of buying hardware, spending a ton of money on consulting to figure out how to do identity and access management on premises. So there's this interest in moving out to the cloud for actually running core identity management functions in the cloud. There's a couple things happening that support this. The first is that this SaaS model that we all know and love, pay as you grow, expenses align with the P&L model, no big bang, right? It's all wonderful for SaaS. Turnkey applications, it's disrupting the IAM space, clearly. And we're seeing the vendors scramble and move in different directions. I'll talk more about that. Organizations want to deploy SaaS applications and identity management applications because they get faster time to value. So let's talk about some of these core components when we talk about identity in the cloud. The first one is the identity bridge. Is anybody familiar with that term? Cool. It's this thing that sits on the edge of your environment that takes Identity 1.0 protocols, think LDAP, Kerberos, and makes them work in an Enterprise 2.0 world so you can connect your users to applications. But it also is bidirectional. It has the ability to take 2.0 protocols, for example, let's say your partners are coming in to access your applications, and convert them to 1.0, things like web access management and getting users in directories. It's essential for most enterprises to do this at scale. Take a look. Here's a classic example of using an identity bridge. You can see right away we have an impedance mismatch between trying to do something at runtime. I don't care what application you're using, the chances are very good you're going to have to provision a user identity at admin time before you can actually make that application work. The reason being is that SaaS applications have service level agreements that dictate that they have their own identity store. So you're going to have to push an identity around to do this. Maybe someday we'll be drinking great drinks and it'll be Cloud Identity Summit 2018 and we'll be laughing about this fact, but that's not the case today. So the role of the identity bridge in this case is to provide directory synchronization, the ability to extend your existing identity management out into the cloud by simply watching your directory, monitoring OUs, group memberships, addition of user identities, and then transparently convert that 1.0 stuff to 2.0 stuff to go into applications, which generally are talking REST and probably using a JSON data model. First thing, that's admin time. And of course, at runtime, you've got the authentication aspects that occur here, where you have users coming in. This is a very vanilla environment. Yours might be different, where they're coming in with maybe curb tickets. They've authenticated at the desktop, right? They've fired up their workstation. They're part of a, workstation's part of a secure domain, and so they have some trust relationships. They can get some tickets. Or they might be using X509, for example, with a mobile device. And the identity bridge is going to sit there, and it's going to simply say, okay, you've been authenticated in the enterprise. I get that. Here's your SAML assertion. Go outside and do single sign-on. It may even do some things like password vaulting, too, which is, you know, it is what it is, right? When we take passwords and replay them, it's for application ubiquity. It's, you know, kind of like having your mother over for Thanksgiving dinner. It's just kind of the thing you have to do. We're talking about from the cloud now with identity bridges. This is the first part of this cloud identity management challenge. And now we're talking about your partners accessing your stuff. Again, trying to translate 2.0 to 1.0. If your applications are SAML aware, you're in great shape, right? Because your partners will come in directly and access your applications. Life is good, right? But what if you're trying to access a web access management application, which is at the bottom of the screen? What happens then? Well, that's the function of the identity bridge with a security token service. They'll take those SAML assertions and rewrite them to WAM cookies so that your partners transparently have access to your apps. Well, let's take a look at how that might work in the API world, where you have partners that want to connect using OpenID Connect or OAuth. The identity bridge there functions as a resource server, an authorization service, an OpenID provider, helps you register the client, and then facilitates getting OAuth tokens to an application. So identity bridges are kind of essential when you want to take this 2.0 world and move it down to 1.0 world. The second part of this, and we'll be spending most of our time here, is on identity management as a service. So a little story, I was at Gartner and we were all feuding a little bit about what to call this nascent market of things where identity management functions were running in the cloud. And some of the folks were really stuck on IAM-ASS, or AAS. See, I already telegraphed the joke, which is just a total bullshit move, but there you go. Or it was IDaaS. I was a proponent of IDaaS because I was really not prepared to sit here and come to Cloud Identity Summit and actually say I am ass every time I was ready to talk about this market segment. Essentially what you've got is you're running identity management functions in the cloud for all the good reasons that we talked about. It can be frequently used with an identity bridge, but it doesn't have to be, just like you can use an identity bridge by itself. A couple of key market trends that we're seeing in this space with respect to IDaaS and the challenges of addressing enterprise cloud identity. We see more and more infrastructure as a service and platform as a service vendors getting into this space. And the classic examples are Salesforce and Microsoft, and of course AWS. Salesforce with Salesforce Identity, they got some smart folks over there. They're doing some interesting things. Microsoft is moving very quickly. Did anybody see, Sean, did you do your talk yet? You got to check out Sean's talk on Azure and the IDaaS space that's going on in there. And essentially, we're now beginning to see Microsoft step in and be able to write backwards, right from the cloud into the enterprise Active Directory store. We're already starting to see that shift. So the other thing we can also talk about is the fact that Amazon AWS, smart guys over there, excellent internal API around authorization to things, was probably closed off to the world until just recently last year when they added SAML Federation SP support. So now you don't have to write a ton of code and hide keys around and do all that stuff. You can connect to AWS using SAML. Good stuff. The second trend that I'll point out to you in this IDaaS space is that we're seeing it already, and it's going to happen for sure, continuing, is that mobile authentication vendors are going to be absorbed into the IDaaS frameworks. So you're going to have these Uber vendors buying tons of multi-factor authentication solutions. There's a reason for it, because it completes an IDaaS offering where perhaps you're offering single sign-on, or you're offering provisioning and you need a stronger authentication. It's already becoming table stakes in the market. So as you look and take a look at IDaaS solutions, particularly in the SSO space, there's a strong coupling of that. The other thing, too, is that MFA by itself, unless it can do a lot of authentication things, and I mean not just radius, right? If you want to do some things with strong authentication, you almost have to look at it like it's the flip side to SSO. Because that's, when I talk to enterprises, they kind of look at authentication and single sign-on almost through the same set of eyes, and they just kind of flip the coin a little bit. Interesting things happening in the IDaaS market. If you take a look, there's generally two classes of products within IDaaS today. There's the SSO authentication market, and then there's the provisioning governance market. So on one side, you're doing all kinds of SSO, you're doing authentication. The other side, you're doing real provisioning with workflow and so on. And you take a look at the attributes of those solutions, and hopefully you can read some of that. If you look on the SSO authentication side, there are a certain set of functionality that's present. There's vaulting, there's the classic SAML federation stuff, but also OAuth and OIDC. There's a directory synchronization stuff that enables you to transparently send your users out into the cloud and provision their identities. There's user management, and here I'm making a distinction between user management and provisioning. User management being very simple, okay, I want to add this user, click. Provisioning is, holy cow, I got to build workflow, and in case Sean's out of town, we have to have somebody else who can approve his access rights, and if he's out of town, then we'll wait 5 days, and then we'll go to somebody else. Not that. And of course, multi-factor. On the other side of things, you've got self-service capabilities, the ability for users to request access to things, also to reset passwords. You've got provisioning, that thing I described, that thing with workflow and separation of duties and so on. You've got access certification as well. But what's happening is it's starting to converge. All these functionality are coming together, and you're seeing the IDaaS vendors put this in one place. And then, of course, you have to overlay a couple of other things that are coming into the party, too. One of them is a cloud directory. We're seeing examples like Stormpath and others, Azure being great examples of using a REST JSON model to expose identities in the cloud, coupling it with some new school things around OAuth and OIDC, right? And of course, we have scoping and delegation. We're seeing a set of tools emerge that focus just on scoping and delegation and will bolt into all these different systems and make them work. Interesting stuff. The market's coming together over time. Let's take a look at one specific this is the in the cloud use case for IDaaS. In the cloud meaning this isn't your problem. This is just somebody who doesn't have any on-premises resources. Everybody's mobile, they're using file sharing in the cloud, whatever. So this is the opportunity. You could probably take a quick nap, but I have to actually put it in to kind of set the context. You have other problems. An IDaaS system is going to do the provisioning, of course, of SaaS applications. It speaks the Identity 2.0 protocols necessary to do it. And then, of course, it's going to authenticate users and then give them single sign-on into the SaaS app. This is bread and butter IDaaS stuff, particularly in the single sign-on / multi-factor space. Again, addressing the runtime requirements of authenticating the user, but before that can happen, addressing the admin time of getting the users into those applications. What's starting to happen now with an IDaaS is that we're exposing directories more in public ways and relying upon them. Here's a classic example of now you take that same system of IDaaS and you expose a public directory to it. Azure would be a great example of this, right? Where you've got something that's public and you can manage users in a way and make authentication calls against it. But you can also couple IDaaS solutions, and we see this frequently actually, where you combine IDaaS and an identity bridge. And what happens here is that you do the directory sync, the identity bridge picks up that stuff and puts it in the IDaaS, and the IDaaS does all the heavy lifting of everywhere you need to do that admin time provisioning that's so necessary to facilitate sign-on. Notice here also that there's really a one-to-many connection that's happening here, an enhancement in scalability, where if you can only have one connection from your enterprise out to the IDaaS and have it do all the heavy lifting, that's pretty cool, right? Today, if you're using Identity Bridge, you have a many-to-many connection where you have your bridge doing all kinds of directory synchronization and user management that way. But we're also seeing variations on this as well, and this is going to increase, seeing more and more of this, where the IDaaS isn't really tied to the enterprise at all. It's tied to something like Google, where maybe at runtime is doing synchronization, or rather doing an authentication, or maybe it's doing directory sync that's feeding this environment. And the enterprise is saying, all right, I want to manage my users in Google, and I just don't, I need a set of tools that Google doesn't provide, for example. And so we're going to use a directory service that's outside the enterprise, off premises. But we're evolving, and we're starting to see needs, and I don't see this happening yet, but clearly there's a problem where we need to be able to, because this explosion of many different user constituencies, we need to think about how we're actually going to manage multiple identity stores. And so, classic example here, I just mentioned it before, I'm going to use my bridge, it's going to take my users, and it's going to put it in IDaaS. I'm going to take care of my employees, right? But what about my partners who need access to things, right? We know partners are demanding greater and greater access to enterprise resources that we have. Well, that's great. We'll now have we'll have to support another directory store. And this is also a push, right? We're all pushing identities from somewhere into the IDaaS, but that's not always going to be the case. We may have partners where we need to, in order to facilitate access to their applications, have the ability to go in and partner and push identities in that space. And then finally, we have externalized cloud identity stores where we have developers, things like Stormpath, where we have to push identities out too. So this is where it's going. We're not there yet. When we start talking about how that works for the enterprise, I'm suggesting to you that there's a huge stumbling block to the adoption of IDaaS for large enterprises today, because it's not enterprise grade. And enterprise grade to me means not just cloud managed, but managing resources across cloud and across the enterprise. So that means we need to be able to have the ability to manage resources within Amazon and EC2, for example. We need to be able to facilitate OpenID style connections to the applications that are running in EC2. But then we also have to be able to reach from the cloud into the enterprise to be able to manage on-premises resources and provide services for that. And we're just not there yet. It's not happening. Not the ability to do all of this stuff and do the configuration management on top of it. My first challenge. My second challenge around cloud identity access governance is this. When we talk about IGA, there are many different things that can be done with an IGA. I'm going to focus on a specific set. Here we have self-service, provisioning. I'm really concerned about entitlement management, because without entitlement management, we can't actually answer the who has access to what question. Everything relies upon it. So if you take a look at role management, separation of duties concerns, access certification, they all require you to have the ability to go look and grab the entitlements. Well, what the hell's an entitlement, right? I just threw up on a slide. I made the classic presentation mistake. Not so much. So this is the definition that Ian Glazer and I cooked up around 2009. An entitlement is a system object that can be granted to enable user access to perform some set of actions in an application. That sounds like a lot of analyst bullshit, doesn't it? Am I right? But we get paid by the word in the analyst world. Really, it's about who has access to what, right? It's just boil it down to that, who has access to what. And as I said before, the who and the what, we're seeing an expansion and complexity resulting from it. So when we talk about who, we have to talk about constituencies and identity stores that are related to them. We have employees and contractors. They're generally on premises. They might be in your HR system, Active Directory, in your IGA system on-prem. They might be in LDAP. They could be anywhere, right? Okay. You have partners and consumers that are somewhere else, right? That's an expansion of who, because now your partners have greater access to your applications. The thing that's killing us in this space is siloing. We have this problem where, because we have off-premises cloud-based apps that require their own identity stores, that it's really hard to be able to pull entitlements out and figure out how this works. If you saw my keynote this morning, there's a little bit about XY. I'm probably going to get rid of all my XY graphs after this, so just stay with me. But complexity of governance gets much harder when you have more distance and you can't control those identity stores. We have a problem with who, we also have a problem with what. Let's take a look at what we have to worry about. We have applications that might be Active Directory-based, WAM, SAML, ERP, SharePoint. And I can say that generally the access to those entitlements are pretty good, right? The IGA system can go in and reach and grab those. What about things like SaaS applications and infrastructure as a service applications? I'm going to be generous and say that this is a maturing area. It's extremely difficult to get entitlements out of a lot of SaaS applications because of the way the API functions, and maybe it's a maturity factor. Similarly, to get audit data out is challenging but maybe achievable. That results in complexity because we don't have access to those things. So if we put it all together, looking at the good old days of what identity governance used to look like, and I say good old days because if you're doing things like separation of duties and access certification today, chances are this is really hard to do, but I'm going to call it the good old days. I've got 1 minute. I'm going to do that space-time thing and squeeze it all into a minute. It's rocket mark.
50 seconds.
50 seconds. Tick, tick. With an IGA system, we're all about taking entitlements and maybe activity out of those systems. It's challenging enough when they're on-prem. But how do we do it in the SSO world? Here's our SSO slide, to the cloud SSO slide, as we talk about it. This is a reminder of how things are stacked. But how do you do entitlement management when your world looks like this, where you have the identity store on-prem, you've got a SaaS application with an identity store, and you've got a federated IDP, and there are access rights all over the place? You have to suck out those entitlements. And then furthermore, you have a big problem in that these identities may not all be the same name. There might be mapping that is occurring between the identity known to the SaaS app and the identity known in the on-premises world. How do you do it? This is how you have to do it, and we're not there yet. You can move from coarse to fine, meaning you can look at your directory and figure out group memberships, but that doesn't get you down too deep into the world of entitlements. But then you also have to look at your federated IDP and figure out what access rights are present there, what LDAP groups get access to what applications. And then finally, you actually have to go look up in the SaaS application and figure out what those actual entitlements are specifically. That's really hard to do. Not many folks are achieving it today, and if they are, they're using a lot of customized capabilities. And what I'm trying to say is that there's an evolution scale to this. When we talk about maturity, AD, LDAP groups, pretty good, right? We can actually go and query the federated identity provider for entitlements. As we move up the stack, as we try to reach out, this is what's going to happen. We're going to have SaaS and infrastructure as a service entitlements. We need to be able to suck those in. And then hopefully over time, we can actually take in activity logs from the federation and the SaaS system. The benefit of doing that is profound because now we can start doing adaptive kinds of things in terms of figuring out access rights. Well, he has access to the customer records, but it's going to take him, he's accessing 400 of those in a day. Probably not a good thing, right? I'm short on time, so if you come find me, I'll make some recommendations. But at this point, I'd like to call Laura Hunter from Microsoft.